What could possibly make a 5-mile strip of coral rock, small enough to walk across in an afternoon, one of the most watched pieces of land on the entire planet? Because on one single night, the United States military hit more than 90 separate targets on that tiny island, and somehow left the oil terminals sitting right next to those targets completely untouched. Before we dig into why that decision matters so much, take a second to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel breaks down stories like this one long before most of the internet catches up, and you will want to see where this goes next. Let's talk about where this island actually is, because once you understand its size compared to what runs through it, this entire story starts to make a very different kind of sense. Kharg Island sits about 25 miles off the coast of mainland Iran, out in the Persian Gulf. It is tiny. You could drive across it in a few minutes, walk across it in a couple of hours if you felt like it, and yet through that one small island flows somewhere close to 90% of every single barrel of crude oil Iran sells to the outside world. Let that sink in for a moment. Not one export route among several, not one terminal among many options. Nearly the entire financial lifeline of an entire country, squeezed through a loading facility small enough to see from end to end out of a single drone camera shot. Picture standing on the mainland coast on a clear day. You can almost make out the shape of the island in the distance, a low, flat outline sitting quietly in blue water. Nothing about it looks dramatic from a distance. No towering skyline, no sprawling industrial complex stretching to the horizon. Just a small patch of coral with a handful of pipelines and loading arms reaching out toward the water. And yet that unassuming little strip of land has, for decades, quietly held more leverage over a national economy than almost anywhere else on Earth. At full capacity, the island can load several massive oil tankers at the same time, moving several million barrels of crude a day, all pumped in directly from pipelines connected to Iran's largest oil fields on the mainland. On that same small patch of coral sits a company producing hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude on its own, along with a major petrochemical operation, all packed onto land you could genuinely explore on foot before lunch. This is not the first time in history this island has found itself in the crosshairs of a war. Back in the 1980s, during the brutal war between Iran and Iraq, Saddam Hussein's forces struck the island again and again, damaging its terminal badly enough that Iran had to shift some of its export operations elsewhere just to keep any oil moving at all. For almost 40 years after that, the island sat largely untouched by that level of violence, until this year. So when American officials point to Kharg Island as the single most obvious pressure point in Iran's entire economy, they are not discovering some hidden secret. They are simply returning to a vulnerability that has been sitting there quietly for 4 decades, waiting. Now let's get into exactly what happened, because the sequence of events here tells you almost everything about the strategy behind it. On March the 13th, 2026, the United States Air Force carried out one of the most intense bombing operations of the entire conflict, striking more than 90 Iranian military sites on Kharg Island in roughly 2 hours. President Trump himself described it as one of the most powerful raids in the history of the Middle East. American officials confirmed the strikes destroyed naval mine storage sites and missile bunkers, the exact kind of weapons Iran had been using to threaten ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian sources reported at least 15 separate explosions rocking the island that night. And here is the part that matters most. The oil terminals themselves were left completely alone, not damaged, not degraded, untouched. For a night that involved more than 90 separate targets and roughly 2 hours of continuous explosions, that kind of restraint is not an accident. It is a message, delivered as loudly and as clearly as any military campaign can deliver one. We can reach every corner of this island whenever we choose. And we are choosing for now not to touch the one thing that actually makes this place worth anything at all. President Trump explained that decision in blunt terms, saying the oil facilities were spared purely out of decency, while warning at the same time that he would reverse that decision immediately if Iran did not stop trying to shut down the strait and attacking commercial ships passing through it. Before we go any further, here is something worth being upfront about. Every figure in this video, the number of targets, the export percentage, the barrel counts, comes from confirmed military statements, independent satellite imagery, and reporting from major outlets with no stake in either side of this conflict winning the narrative war. Where a claim comes only from Iranian state media and has not been independently confirmed, I will tell you clearly that it is a claim, not settled fact. In a story surrounded by this much political noise, that distinction is everything. So how did we actually get here? The road to that burning island on March the 13th actually started 2 weeks earlier, on February the 28th, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of strikes against Iran known as Operation Epic Fury. That opening campaign hit military bases, missile sites, and command centers across the country in a matter of hours. Iran responded almost immediately by targeting the Strait of Hormuz itself, warning every commercial ship in the water that safe passage could no longer be guaranteed. Within days, shipping traffic through a strait that normally carries roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil and gas supply had collapsed by more than 70%. By the time American military planners sat down to build a target list for Kharg Island in early March, the logic was already obvious. If Iran was going to use its navy and its missiles to hold the world's most important waterway hostage, then hitting the exact island that funds that entire military machine was always going to be next. The strike put Iran's government in a strange position. Officials tried to sound calm in public, insisting no workers or military personnel were hurt, and that operations on the island were continuing as normal. But at almost the same time, an Iranian oil ministry official described the very same attack as massive and destructive, with nearly 2 hours of non-stop explosions shaking the entire island. Those two versions cannot both be true at once, and that contradiction alone tells you something about the pressure Tehran was actually under while trying to manage the story back home. Iran's foreign minister also claimed the strikes had actually been launched from bases inside the United Arab Emirates, an accusation the UAE flatly denied. Given the range limitations of the weapons involved and the distance to the island, that explanation never quite lined up with the geography. It read far more like an attempt to drag a third country into the blame, rather than a serious technical claim about what actually happened that night. If you're finding this story as wild as I did while putting it together, do me one small favor. Leave a comment telling me one thing you learned so far that genuinely surprised you. It helps this video reach more people who need to see it, and I promise, I read every single one. What followed the March strike was weeks of genuine brinkmanship. Trump publicly floated the idea of not just bombing Kharg Island again, but physically taking control of it, seizing the terminal outright to cut off Iran's oil revenue at the source instead of simply weakening its military presence one strike at a time. Reports emerged that roughly 5,000 Marines and sailors were being sent into the Persian Gulf. Just days later, another 3,000 paratroopers were reportedly ordered to the region as well. That kind of troop movement is not symbolic. It is the sort of deployment you make when an actual amphibious or airborne operation is being seriously planned, not just discussed for headlines. A White House official told reporters directly that the American military could take control of Kharg Island at any time it chose to. There were no immediate plans to send troops in at that exact moment, but every option remained on the table. Think about the psychology of a statement like that for a second. It is not just a description of military capability. It is a deliberate piece of pressure aimed straight at Tehran's decision-makers. A public reminder that the distance between where things stand today and a full occupation is measured in hours, not months, whenever Washington decides to close that gap. Iranian media, meanwhile, reported that the March strikes had specifically targeted air defenses, a naval base, an airport control tower, and a helicopter hangar on the island. If accurate, that detail tells you this was never a random bombing run. It was a deliberate effort to strip away the island's ability to defend itself against exactly the kind of larger operation that seemed to be forming. Iran's armed forces responded to the seizure talk with a warning of their own, stating that any energy infrastructure connected to companies working with the United States would be, in their words, immediately destroyed and turned to ash if Washington ever crossed the line into striking the actual oil terminals. That threat was aimed less at American troops directly, and more at every shipping company, insurer, and foreign buyer still doing business anywhere near Iranian oil, a reminder that escalation cuts in more than one direction. Military analysts pushed back hard on the idea of an actual seizure, warning it would be an extremely risky move. Even holding the island physically would not reopen the Strait of Hormuz, since Iran would still control the mainland coastline and the missile batteries lining it. Occupying foreign territory long-term carries a completely different category of political and military risk compared to a strike package that arrives and leaves before sunrise. So through April and into May, the situation settled into an uneasy rhythm. Strikes hit Kharg periodically, always aimed at the military footprint, never at the loading terminals. Satellite images kept showing tankers still docked there days after each new round of strikes, oil still moving, just slower and far, less predictably than before. Then, in early May, something strange showed up in the satellite record. Multiple imaging systems picked up a large slick of gray and white water stretching across roughly 45 kilometers just west of the island, one of the biggest suspected oil spills of the entire conflict, tracked across several days by different satellites. Independent researchers who study environmental damage in conflict zones described it as visually consistent with an oil spill, based on its shape, its drift pattern, and its coloring compared to known ballast, water, and natural seep patterns in that part of the Gulf. Iran's government denied any connection to military activity, claiming instead that the slick came from a foreign tanker illegally dumping contaminated ballast water nearby. That explanation genuinely could be true. Ballast dumping is a real and documented problem in busy shipping lanes around the world, but it is worth noting how convenient the particular explanation happened to be, appearing in the exact waters surrounding the exact facility that kept getting struck by the exact military that very much wanted to see Iran's oil exports slow down. Nobody outside Iran's own investigators knows for certain what caused that slick, but the timing alone is hard to ignore. Then came July, and this is where the story genuinely escalated into something new. On July the 7th, American forces launched what officials called a large-scale precision strike, hitting more than 80 locations across Iran in a single coordinated operation. Kharg Island was directly in that mix, with Iranian state media reporting fresh explosions in the early hours. This was not a one-off event anymore. This was the fifth wave in an escalating sequence, and it landed alongside a decision to fully reimpose sanctions on Iranian oil sales, closing off a financial backdoor that had been letting some Iranian crude quietly slip out through alternative buyers. American officials went so far as to publicly describe Kharg Island using a specific phrase worth repeating exactly, calling it the nexus for all of Iran's oil supply. Not a hub, not a facility, the nexus. When officials choose language like that on the record, it tells you the underlying strategy has not shifted at all since March. Hit everything surrounding the oil, never the oil itself. At least, not yet. And the strikes kept coming after that. Just over a week later, on the 6th and 7th consecutive nights of this renewed campaign, American forces hit Iranian command centers and missile sites, while separately striking an oil tanker reportedly on its way toward Kharg Island, along with coastal defense positions on a nearby island. That single detail matters more than it might seem at first. Striking a tanker actively heading toward Kharg is a completely different kind of pressure than striking bunkers on the island itself. It means the campaign now extends out into open water, choking the supply chain before ships even arrive, rather than staying confined to one patch of coral. Around that same time, President Trump was quoted issuing an even harder warning, threatening that continued defiance from Iran would leave the country with no bridges and no power plants left standing, a noticeably tougher line than the decency framing he had used back in March to explain why the oil terminals were being spared. By the middle of July, market analysts tracking the situation noted that crude oil had climbed back toward $80 a barrel, reversing a large chunk of the price decline that had followed an earlier attempt at a ceasefire, driven almost entirely by speculation over whether Washington would finally act on the seizure talk. Gasoline futures were up more than 14% in a single month. Heating oil was up more than 24%. The International Energy Agency went on record describing the disruption from this entire conflict as the largest supply shock the global oil market has ever experienced, a genuinely staggering statement given everything oil markets have already lived through over the decades. Numbers like that rarely stay confined to trading floors and financial headlines. They filter down, slowly but surely, into everyday life for people who have never once thought about the Strait of Hormuz or heard the name Kharg Island. A jump in heating oil futures shows up months later as a higher winter bill. A spike in gasoline futures shows up the next time you fill up your car. The distance between a bombed island in the Persian Gulf and your own monthly budget is a lot shorter than most people ever realize, right up until the moment it isn't. Buried inside the shipping data was something even more remarkable. During the peak of the blockade in late May, Kharg Island reportedly went 12 straight days without loading a single barrel of crude onto a single tanker. 12 days for a terminal built to move several million barrels every single day. That is not a disruption. That is closer to an economic siege, achieved almost entirely through the threat and reality of continued strikes rather than any single knockout blow. If this video is actually helping this conflict make sense to you, in a way most short clips online never manage to do, share it with someone who keeps asking you, what's actually happening in the Middle East right now? It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing but a tap. Let's talk about the hardware for a moment, because understanding how you hit 90 separate targets on an island that size without ever touching the oil sitting right next to them is a genuinely difficult targeting problem, far harder than it sounds on paper. Picture a crowded parking lot where almost every vehicle is completely legal, except for one specific row that needs to be towed, away without so much as scratching the paint on anything nearby. That is roughly the scale of precision required here. It takes guided weapons with extremely tight targeting margins, real-time satellite and drone confirmation of exactly which structure is which before any weapon is released, and a willingness to fly multiple separate passes instead of one broad bombing run. The naval mine storage sites and missile bunkers hit in March, and again in July, were not scattered randomly. They sat inside hardened purpose-built structures, specifically because Iran already suspected this island was circled on a target map somewhere long before the war began. That is exactly why Iran had already moved additional military personnel and air defenses onto Kharg in the weeks leading up to the March strike. according to people familiar with American intelligence at the time, essentially trying to reinforce a target it already knew was coming. It is also worth pointing out just how restrained this entire approach has been compared to what a truly unrestrained campaign against this island could have looked like. If the goal from the very beginning had simply been maximum economic damage, without any concern for consequences, the fastest and cheapest way to gut Iran's oil revenue would have been a handful of direct strikes on the loading terminals and storage tanks themselves. There would have been no need for dozens of separate precision passes against hardened bunkers scattered across the island. Instead, every single wave of strikes so far has deliberately left the actual export infrastructure standing, which tells you this was never really about destruction for its own sake. It has been about maintaining constant, visible leverage. An intact terminal surrounded by rubble is a far more powerful negotiating tool than a smoking crater, because a crater removes the threat entirely, while an intact terminal sitting inside a demolished military perimeter is a standing reminder of exactly how much worse things could get with a single change of orders. It is the geopolitical version of leaving a cash register untouched, while methodically dismantling every lock, camera, and alarm system surrounding it, a message that the money is still there, and that everyone in the room knows exactly how easy it would now be to take it. Now let's zoom out, because the ripple effects from this one island genuinely spread far beyond Iran's own coastline, and this is honestly one of the most overlooked parts of the entire story. China buys a significant share of the oil moving through Kharg Island, with Iranian crude accounting for roughly 1/10 of China's total seaborne oil imports this year alone. That is a meaningful slice of one of the largest energy-consuming economies on the planet. Every time Kharg goes quiet for a stretch, whether from direct strikes or from tanker owners simply becoming too nervous to show up, that translates into a direct hit on Chinese energy planning. It is part of why Beijing has repeatedly called for the strait and the surrounding shipping lanes to remain open for normal traffic, while carefully avoiding any direct military involvement on Iran's behalf. It is a genuinely awkward position for China to sit in, publicly calling for stability while quietly remaining one of the few major buyers still purchasing discounted Iranian crude despite the sanctions risk involved. Satellite tracking of tankers, signaling as Chinese-owned, managing to slip through the strait, even during the tightest blockade periods, only underscores how much Beijing has riding on Kharg, staying at least partially functional. Meanwhile, inside the Gulf itself, things have gotten genuinely messy between countries that are technically supposed to be on the same side of this conflict. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have spent much of this year drifting apart, rather than coordinating backing opposing sides in conflicts happening in both Yemen and Sudan. A strike involving Saudi forces on an Emirati weapons shipment pushed the UAE to pull its own forces out of Yemen entirely. The UAE even exited a major oil-producing alliance earlier this year to set its own independent policy in the middle of an active war, about as clear a sign of regional disunity as you are likely to find. Two of the wealthiest and most militarily capable states in the region essentially refusing to move in the same direction, while a shared adversary sits just off their shared coastline, watching every bit of it unfold. And Iran has not been shy about exploiting that gap. In mid-July, Iranian missiles struck 2 UAE-flagged tankers in nearby waters, killing at least one crew member, an incident several regional analysts pointed to as evidence that Tehran now effectively treats the UAE as an active participant in this conflict. Regardless of whether Abu Dhabi has formally joined any coalition against it, that matters enormously if the United States ever decides to move forward with an actual seizure of Kharg Island, because an operation like that would almost certainly require staging bases, logistical support, and likely direct participation from regional partners. Right now, those partners cannot even agree with each other, let alone present a unified front against Iran. It is genuinely one of the more underappreciated obstacles standing between where this conflict sits today and any dramatic escalation toward a full ground or amphibious operation. You can stage every Marine and paratrooper in the region, but without a coherent regional coalition backing that kind of operation logistically, that hardware simply sits in place far longer than the headlines about it would ever suggest. So where does all of this actually leave us? There are really 3 ways this keeps playing out from where things stand right now. The first path is simply more of the same. A continued cycle of precision strikes that weaken Kharg's military defenses and occasionally choke off tanker loadings for days or weeks at a time without ever crossing the line into hitting the oil terminals directly or physically occupying the island. In many ways, this is the lowest risk option for Washington. It keeps enormous pressure on Iran without triggering a full occupation scenario, and it preserves the appearance of restraint that lets officials keep saying they are sparing the oil infrastructure out of decency, even while squeezing Iran's revenue through sustained disruption around the edges. The second path represents a genuine dramatic escalation, an actual seizure of the island itself, using the marine and airborne assets already quietly staged in the region since March. This remains the highest risk, highest reward option on the table. It would be the single most direct way to permanently cut off Iran's oil revenue, rather than just periodically disrupting it. But it carries serious downside too, holding foreign territory long-term against a hostile mainland just a short distance away, absorbing the diplomatic fallout of what would essentially be an act of occupation, and doing all of that without the full support of regional partners who currently cannot agree on basic policy toward each other. There is also the question of what happens the moment American boots actually touch that coral. A strike package is something both sides can quietly walk back the next morning. Troops holding ground is a fact on the map that everyone involved has to live with indefinitely. And Iran has already signaled it would treat any strike on the oil terminals themselves as grounds for retaliation far beyond the island. It is reasonable to assume an actual occupation would draw an even harder response, not a softer one. The third path, and the one that might have the best chance of ending this particular piece of the conflict without either side dramatically backing down, is that the economic math simply becomes unsustainable for Iran before Washington ever needs to seize anything at all. 12 days without loading a single barrel is not a bruise. For a government this dependent on one primary source of revenue, that is closer to internal bleeding. If sustained strikes and reimposed sanctions keep Kharg's output unreliable for long enough, the gap between confident state, media language, and the actual collapsing export numbers eventually becomes too wide to hide. And that is usually the point where negotiated outcomes start to look far more attractive to a government than they did just months earlier. There is a fourth possibility worth sitting with too, one that gets discussed the least, even though it might matter more than any of the others. Every wave of strikes so far, 5 of them and counting since March, has followed almost the exact same pattern. Hit the military perimeter hard, spare the terminals. Let their resulting uncertainty do the actual economic damage. That consistency is itself a signal. This does not look like improvisation. It looks like a deliberate, repeatable strategy that can run indefinitely without ever requiring the kind of dramatic seizure operation that markets keep pricing in every time oil ticks back up toward $80 a barrel. If that reading is accurate, the most likely outcome in the near term is not a sudden invasion, and it is not a sudden ceasefire either. It is simply strike wave. Number 6, then 7, then 8, each one slightly more targeted than the last, until either Iran's negotiating position finally cracks under the accumulated pressure, or the political calculation in Washington shifts toward finishing the job on the ground. Here is the question worth sitting with as this video wraps up. Do you think the United States eventually follows through on an actual physical seizure of Kharg Island, given how much military hardware has already been quietly staged in the region since March? Or do you think the strike and squeeze approach, hitting everything surrounding the oil without ever touching it directly, ends up being the more effective long-term strategy, precisely because it avoids the exact occupation risks analysts keep warning about? Type your answer below. I read every single one, and I would genuinely love to know which way you think this breaks. Either way, keep an eye on the tanker loading numbers over the coming weeks. If Kharg goes quiet again for anything close to 12 days, that alone will likely tell you more about where this conflict is heading than any single statement out of Washington or Tehran. It is easy to watch footage of explosions on a coral outcrop that most people could not have found on a map 6 months ago, and treat it as just another data point in a distant war happening somewhere far away. But every strike wave on that island eventually shows up somewhere much closer to home, in a gas station price sign, in a shipping insurance quote, in a bag of fertilizer that costs more than it did last spring. Kharg Island is small enough to walk across in an afternoon, and large enough to move the entire global economy every single time it goes quiet. That gap between its physical size and its actual leverage is, in many ways, the whole story of this conflict. Compressed down into one tiny piece of coral sitting off the coast of a country most people could not point to on a map before this year. And that is exactly why this is a story worth actually understanding, rather than glancing at a headline and scrolling straight past it. Because the next time oil prices jump for reasons nobody at your dinner table can quite explain, there is a real chance the answer is sitting right there on a 5-mile island in the Persian Gulf, still standing, still watched, and still waiting to see what happens next. Wars like this one rarely announce themselves through a single dramatic moment that everyone remembers years later. More often, they unfold through exactly this kind of pattern. Strike after strike, warning after warning. An island that keeps almost falling and never quite does, until one day the accumulated pressure finally forces a decision nobody can put off any longer. Whether that decision comes from Washington, from Tehran, or from the oil markets themselves finally running out of patience, Kharg Island will most likely be sitting right at the center of it, exactly as it has been since the very first night this story began. If this breakdown helped you finally understand why one tiny island keeps showing up in every headline about this conflict, hit the like button before you go. It genuinely helps this channel keep putting real research time into stories that deserve more than a quick skim. And subscribe if you haven't already, because this story is nowhere near finished, and I will see you in the next one.